Okay, so, lately, everyone's been talking about new jobs, where are they coming from?
Right.
And you hear a lot about government hiring being this, like, big factor.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, of course, everyone's wondering, what's the real story?
Totally.
What do the numbers actually say? And, why should I even care about this?
Right.
So that's exactly what we're going to unpack in this deep dive today.
Awesome.
We've gone through a ton of stuff like online discussions, what people are saying.
Mm.
We looked at those big economic indicators, GDP, inflation, all that.
Right.
And we even dug into the different ways people view government employment.
Yeah, the different sides of the argument.
Exactly. It's fascinating. Our mission today is to basically give you like this clear picture of how government jobs have actually shaped things over the past 5 years.
Okay.
And we want to make sure you get those aha moments,
Right.
but without like drowning you in super complicated detail.
Exactly. It's about like cutting through the noise
and
really figuring out what's going on underneath.
Totally.
And I think what's so interesting right off the bat is how you can have the same facts, but totally different conclusions depending on like your perspective.
It's true.
It really is.
Okay, so let's just get right to it.
All right.
Have government jobs actually been driving a lot of this job growth that we've seen? And like the simple answer is yes.
Yeah.
We've seen more hiring across the board.
Sure.
Federal, state, local, like everywhere.
Across the public sector.
So then the question becomes why?
Yeah, what's fueling this?
Right. And our sources point to a bunch of reasons.
Okay.
First one that jumps out is pandemic recovery.
Yeah.
And all that stimulus spending that came with it.
Right.
So think about it. You've got all these relief programs to manage. Public health challenges, obviously huge during that time.
Absolutely.
And all those infrastructure projects trying to get going again.
Right. Trying to jumpstart things.
And all of that needs people.
Yeah. It takes manpower.
Right.
So the sheer scale of the pandemic and like the government's response, it just required a big boost to the public sector.
Right. And some of that was temporary.
Sure.
But it also led to like some lasting changes, especially in areas like public health.
Yeah, for sure. Public health infrastructure definitely needed a boost.
Okay, so then you've got the bipartisan infrastructure law.
Right.
That was a pretty big deal.
Right. Yeah, that was huge.
And it makes sense that it would create a ton of jobs.
Yeah.
Particularly in things like construction.
Construction, for sure.
Transportation. Environmental work.
These are big projects that are going to need people for a long time.
Right. And, it had support from both sides.
Which is pretty rare these days.
Exactly. So that suggests that, like, everyone agreed that these investments were necessary.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so another thing that's been happening is that a lot of government workers are retiring. So it seems like a lot of these longtime employees are hitting retirement age.
Okay.
Which means a lot of empty spots to fill.
Right. So you've got all these vacancies.
And in some cases, it's actually leading to even more staff overall.
And
this isn't just a government thing. This is happening in a lot of industries.
Across the board.
But in government with, it's known for being stable employment.
Yeah, that sense of security.
It means these retirements are leaving like a lot of open positions.
Yeah, so it's not just about filling the same roles. They're also thinking about what they'll need in the future.
Right, they're reevaluating things.
Yeah.
Okay, then you've got the growing demand for public services.
Okay.
So things like education, law enforcement, healthcare.
Those essential services.
Yeah, and as the population grows and, society's needs change.
Yeah.
It just makes sense that these areas would need more people.
For sure. And as those expectations for services increase, you need the people to actually provide them. Otherwise, you can't keep up.
Totally. Okay, last thing our sources pointed to is military and defense spending.
Yeah.
Which has been going up. And also the need for cybersecurity.
Huge these days.
Right. That's just exploding.
Absolute.
So all of that's leading to more federal hiring.
Yeah. With everything going on in the world and all the digital threats, it's no surprise.
Yeah.
They need more expertise in those areas.
Now, just to be clear, the private sector has been adding jobs too.
Right. It's not just government.
It's not like a one-sided thing.
Exactly.
But the point is, government hiring has been a big part of it.
It's been a major factor.
And here's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Especially if you're someone who, leans conservative.
Right.
So in 2023, government employment jumped by like 709,000 jobs.
Wow.
And that's just in 1 year.
That's a big jump.
Yeah. And by September of that year, it was already higher than it was before the pandemic.
So it bounced back quickly.
Yeah.
And surpassed where it was.
Yeah.
So I can see why people would be looking at that.
Yeah, and saying, hold on.
What's going on here?
And then this number is even more eye-catching.
Okay.
As of November 2024, the federal government had over 3 million employees.
Wow.
That's the highest it's been since September 1994.
That's a long time.
Yeah.
So that number definitely carries some weight.
Totally.
It's going to raise some concerns.
Yeah, but the size of the government.
For sure. How big is it getting?
Okay, so with all these new government employees, what does that actually do to the GDP?
That's the big question.
Right. And our source says it's a bit different than when a private company hires someone.
Right. So what's the difference?
Well, government jobs mainly contribute to GDP through government spending.
Okay.
So it's like a direct injection of funds into the economy.
Okay.
And it's not just salaries. It's also things like infrastructure projects.
Yeah, all those projects.
Defense contracts, providing public services.
All that counts as government spending.
Okay.
Which adds to GDP.
So it's part of that G in the GDP equation.
Exactly.
Consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports.
You got it.
I paid attention in Econ 101.
All right.
It stuck with me all those years ago.
And then those government employees.
Yeah.
They spend their earnings too.
Right.
Which boosts consumer spending.
Yeah.
Which is like the biggest part of GDP.
It's like a ripple effect.
Totally. It goes through the whole economy.
Yeah, it spreads out.
So the source also mentions some like less direct ways that government jobs can affect GDP.
Okay. How so?
For example, investing in infrastructure.
Okay.
Like better roads, public transit can actually make businesses more efficient.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Which then helps the economy grow in the long term.
So it's like setting the stage for the private sector to do well.
Yeah, and things like having good regulations.
Okay.
And a stable legal system that can reduce uncertainty for businesses. Yeah, because they know what to expect.
Yeah, and that can encourage them to invest more.
It makes them feel more confident.
Exactly.
So the government's kind of like laying the groundwork for a healthy economy.
Right.
Building that foundation.
Okay, but then we get to this thing called the crowding out effect.
Okay, what is that?
So this is the worry.
Okay.
That if the government hires too many people, it could actually hurt job growth in the private sector.
Okay, so how would that happen?
Well, one way is by competing for the same skilled workers.
Oh, I see. So, like if the government is offering great jobs with good benefits,
it might be hard for businesses to attract the same talent.
Makes sense.
And then the other way is through higher taxes.
Okay.
Because you need to pay those government salaries somehow.
Right.
And if taxes go up, that can make it harder for businesses to invest and grow.
Right. It eats into their profits.
Exact.
So it's like this balancing act between the public and private sectors.
And the source makes this really important point.
Okay.
That private sector jobs usually create GDP more directly because they're making goods and services and innovating.
Yeah, creating new things.
While public sector jobs are more about supporting that activity, but not necessarily creating new wealth in the same way.
So it's like two different approaches to generating economic activity.
Right. And that kind of gets to the heart of why this whole government job growth thing makes conservatives and libertarians nervous.
Okay, it's not just about big government in general.
No, it goes deeper than that.
So what are the specific concerns?
Well, a big one is this idea of return on investment.
Okay.
So in a private company, you invest money.
Yeah.
You expect to make a profit.
Right.
That's how you know it's working.
That's the bottom line.
But with government agencies, they're funded by taxes.
Yeah.
And there's not that same profit motive.
Right.
So it's harder to say, okay, is this actually efficient?
Is it really worth the money? It's a harder thing to measure.
Right. And the argument is that a lot of government jobs are basically taking existing wealth and redistributing it.
Okay.
Rather than creating new wealth.
So it's about where the money's going.
Yeah. And whether it's being used to actually grow the economy.
Versus just moving it around.
Then there's this concern about bureaucracy.
Oh, yeah. The classic bureaucracy complaint.
The idea is that more government hiring just leads to more red tape.
Yeah, more layers.
Unnecessary positions.
People just pushing paper.
And just this general lack of incentive to be efficient.
Right.
Because unlike a private company, there's not that constant competition.
You're not fighting to survive.
Exactly.
You don't have to constantly adapt.
Right. And so the worry is that government agencies can just keep going.
Yeah.
Even if they're not doing a great job.
Even if they're not efficient.
And then we talked about that crowding out thing earlier.
Right, where the government might be taking resources away from the private sector.
And that could mean skilled workers.
Right.
Or it could mean investment capital.
Yeah, because of higher taxes.
Exactly.
So it's like this concern that government is getting in the way of the private sector doing its thing.
And then, of course, there's that philosophical argument about the role of government.
Right.
That whole nanny state idea.
Yeah, where the government is seen as doing too much.
Yeah, and that for conservatives and libertarians, that's a problem.
Because it's seen as undermining individual responsibility and free markets.
And they often see that growth of government as making people more dependent on the state, which they view as a bad thing.
So it's a fundamental disagreement about the role of government in society.
Okay, but the source does present some counter-arguments to those concerns.
Okay, so what are the other side's points?
Well, a big one is that a lot of government jobs are just essential.
Okay.
Like you need them for a functioning society.
Right.
Think about infrastructure, education, public safety.
Yeah, those are core functions.
And the source points out that even people who want smaller government, they still generally support things like national defense and law enforcement, which are also government functions.
True.
That don't have like a direct financial return.
They're not generating profits.
Right, but they're still considered necessary.
Yeah, you need those things for a stable society.
Exactly.
And the private sector usually can't provide them effectively.
Or doesn't want to.
Right.
Because there's no profit in it.
Okay.
And then the source also says that some people see government hiring, especially in things like research and development or cybersecurity, as an investment in the future.
Right, so it's not just wasteful spending.
Exactly.
It's strategic.
It's about being prepared.
Yeah, for future challenges.
So let's talk about this idea of overhead.
Okay.
Because the source brings up this really interesting question.
Okay, what is it?
Don't all organizations have overhead?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Even private companies.
Of course they have things like HR, IT, legal, accounting.
All that stuff.
Yeah, it's just the cost of doing business.
And the answer is obviously yes.
Right. Every organization needs that stuff.
But the difference is how it's managed and justified.
Okay, so how is it different?
Well, in a private company, overhead is seen as an expense. But it's an expense that cuts into your profits.
Right.
So there's this huge incentive to keep it as low as possible.
Yeah, you want to minimize those costs.
And there are all sorts of ways to do that.
Outsourcing, automation.
All that.
Right.
But in government, the argument is that there's not that same pressure.
Because there's no profit motive.
Exactly.
So they don't have to be as careful.
And there's no like direct bottom line.
Right.
So it's harder to justify every single expense.
And sometimes programs can just keep running.
Yeah.
Even if they're not really efficient.
But here's where it gets kind of ironic.
Yeah.
The source points out that a lot of big corporations, especially in those heavily regulated industries,
like finance,
healthcare,
defense,
they actually end up with these massive internal bureaucracies.
Oh, wow.
That look a lot like government agencies.
So even in the private sector, you get that same complexity.
Yeah.
All those layers.
And it's all because of things like compliance, risk management, reporting.
Yeah, all those things.
So the source says the real issue isn't whether you have overhead or not.
Right. Because everyone does.
It's how well you manage it.
Yeah.
And that's true for both private companies and government agencies.
So it's about good management practices.
Yeah.
Accountability.
Totally.
Making sure you're being efficient.
Okay, now let's put on our economist hats for a second.
Okay.
And look at GDP and inflation.
All right.
So how would someone in finance view this increase in government hiring?
Yeah. What would they be focused on?
Well, they'd probably say it's not inherently good or bad.
Okay.
It really depends on what it does to those key indicators.
GDP and inflation. So how does it affect those things?
So let's say these government jobs are in areas that lead to productive investments.
Okay.
Like better infrastructure, improving public safety, or having a more educated workforce.
Right.
That could be really good for GDP growth in the long run.
Makes sense.
Because it makes the whole economy more efficient.
Yeah, it's like laying the groundwork.
But if the hiring is mostly in administrative roles or jobs that are kind of redundant, it might boost GDP in the short term because of the government spending.
Right.
But it's not really creating that long-term growth.
Yeah, it's not adding to the productive capacity of the economy.
Exactly.
So it's about the quality of those jobs.
Yeah. What are they actually doing?
Are they contributing to something valuable?
And then there's the timing of it all.
Okay.
So if the economy is already doing really well,
yeah,
an economist might say, wait a minute.
Yeah.
If the government keeps hiring a bunch of people, that could actually take resources away from the private sector.
Oh, I see.
Where they could be used more efficiently.
Right. So it could actually slow down growth.
Potentially.
Interesting.
But if the economy is slow and there's not a lot of growth,
right,
then government hiring might be a good way to stimulate things.
To get things moving again.
Okay, what about inflation?
Yeah. How does that play into it?
Well, the source says there are a few ways it could affect things.
Okay.
So if government hiring puts more money in people's pockets,
yeah,
especially if there aren't enough workers to go around.
Right, a tight labor market.
That could drive up demand.
Okay.
And lead to what's called demand pull inflation.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
And then if you have more government workers,
yeah,
that could mean higher taxes.
Right, to pay for their salaries.
Or it could mean more government debt.
Yeah.
Either way, businesses might end up raising prices.
To cover those costs.
Exactly.
And that gets passed on to consumers.
And that's called cost push inflation. And then there's the fact that if the government is competing with businesses for workers, that can drive up wages.
Because they have to offer more to attract people.
And that can also contribute to inflation.
Okay, so it can have a pretty significant impact.
Oh, it's all connected.
It's complicated, all these moving parts.
So the source says, if inflation is already high, an economist would probably be worried about government hiring making it worse.
Right, because it could fuel those inflationary pressures.
But if inflation is low, or the economy is in a recession, then government hiring might actually be helpful.
Oh, interesting.
Because it could help stabilize things.
Without making inflation worse.
Exactly.
So it really depends on the context, the state of the economy.
And then finally, the source talks about the size of the government workforce compared to how much the private sector is growing.
Right.
So if government hiring is helping the private sector grow, like by investing in infrastructure that benefits businesses, that's seen as a good thing.
Right. It's complementary.
Yeah, it's like a positive multiplier effect.
Okay.
But if government employment is going up while the private sector is struggling, that raises some red flags.
Because it suggests that something's out of balance.
Exactly.
And it might not be sustainable.
Okay, so let's look back at how those key indicators have actually performed.
Okay, over the last 5 years.
Yeah, so the source gives us some numbers.
Right.
In 2024, GDP growth was about 2.8%.
Okay.
Which was slightly lower than the 2.9% in 2023.
A little bit of a slowdown.
Yeah, a tiny bit.
Okay.
And then throughout 2024, we saw quarterly growth rates ranging from 2.3% to 3.1%.
So some ups and downs.
Yeah, but overall pretty consistent.
Okay.
And then inflation has obviously been a big issue.
Right, it's been all over the news.
Yeah, since the pandemic, it's been above the Fed's target of 2%.
Consistently.
Yeah, and it's expected to stay there.
So that's a concern.
Definitely.
Okay.
And then we have those government employment numbers.
Right.
That big increase of 709,000 jobs in 2023.
A big jump.
And federal employment hitting its highest level since 1994.
Yeah, we talked about that.
Right.
Yeah.
So the source says that the main story out there is that this government hiring is linked to inflation.
Yeah.
And the rising cost of living.
Okay.
And all this regulation that people are feeling.
Right.
But the source also says that blaming it all on government hiring is way too simplistic.
Yeah, it's more complicated than that.
Right.
There are other factors involved.
Yeah, things like supply chain problems, changes in how people are spending money.
Okay.
And just the overall global economy.
Right. It's a globalized world.
It's not just happening here.
Exactly.
It's like this whole glass half full versus glass half empty situation.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
The source actually uses those words.
Interesting.
Where both sides are using the same data to back up their own views.
Totally different interpretations.
Yeah.
Based on their beliefs.
So the glass half full people, the liberal progressive side, they might see this increase in government hiring as a good thing.
Okay.
A sign of recovery.
Especially after the pandemic.
Exactly.
Where a lot of public sector jobs were lost.
And they might say that these new hires are crucial for providing those essential services.
Like infrastructure, education, healthcare.
And they might argue that it's helping to stabilize the economy because it's giving people jobs and boosting consumer spending.
Yeah.
Especially when the private sector is also growing.
So it's like they're working together to create a more stable economy.
And this viewpoint really emphasizes the role of government as a safety net.
Providing for people.
And investing in things that benefit everyone.
Public goods.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about the glass half empty side?
So the conservative libertarian view, they see this as government just getting too big.
Right. Too much government.
More bureaucrats, more regulations, more waste.
And they're the ones paying for it.
Exactly, through their taxes.
Yeah.
And they'd argue that this money could have been used better.
By individuals and businesses?
Yeah. In the private sector.
Where it could create more growth.
And they might say that this government hiring is distorting the labor market.
Okay.
Making wages go up artificially.
Yeah.
And making it harder for small businesses to compete.
Because they can't afford to pay as much.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's that whole nanny state thing again, where they see government getting too involved.
In people's lives.
Yeah.
Taking away freedom.
So this side really prioritizes limited government.
Yeah.
Individual liberty, free markets.
That's their core belief.
That's what they see as driving prosperity.
Oh, okay.
But then the source throws in this reality check.
Oh, okay.
Saying both sides have good points, but also some blind spots.
So it's not so black and white.
Right.
There's nuance.
Yeah.
So what are some of those nuances?
Well, government employment can definitely help stabilize things.
Yeah.
But if it grows too much, it can become inefficient. Yeah. And regulation is important to protect people.
Right.
But too much bureaucracy can stifle innovation.
And make it hard for businesses to operate.
And while government hiring can put pressure on wages, it's not the only thing causing inflation.
There are all those other factors.
Exactly.
So it's about finding that balance between those competing perspectives.
And the source basically says that this debate isn't just about numbers.
Yeah.
It's about ideology.
What you believe about the role of government.
Exactly.
So it's about values as much as it is about economics.
And that's why you can have the same data and totally different conclusions.
Depending on your worldview.
Okay, so the big question is there even a middle ground?
Especially in today's climate.
Yeah, it feels like everyone's at the extremes.
Yeah, it's hard to find that common ground.
The source acknowledges that.
Yeah.
But it does try to outline a more centrist approach.
A more pragmatic way of looking at it.
Exactly.
Okay.
I like that. So when it comes to government employment, this middle path might involve something called right-sizing.
Okay, what does that mean?
So instead of just automatically hiring more people or cutting jobs, it's about finding the right size for the workforce.
Okay, so it's more tailored to the specific needs.
And it would involve doing those efficiency audits to see where there's waste or redundancy.
Right, making sure things are running smoothly.
And it might also mean exploring public-private partnerships.
Okay.
Where maybe the private sector can actually do certain things better.
So it's about finding the best way to deliver services.
Exactly.
Whether it's government or private.
And then with regulation, it's about finding that balance between protecting people and letting businesses do their thing.
Right.
So that might involve getting rid of regulations that are outdated or unnecessary.
Yeah, cutting the red tape.
Exactly.
Making it easier for businesses to operate.
And making sure that any new regulations are based on solid data.
Yeah.
Not just ideology.
So it's about being thoughtful.
Yeah.
And evidence-based.
And then with inflation, the middle ground would focus on those root causes.
Right.
Things like supply chains, energy costs, what's happening in global markets.
It's globalized world.
And it would also focus on policies that make the economy more productive.
Okay.
So increasing supply.
Right. So it's not just about government spending.
It's about addressing those bigger forces.
And they're driving inflation.
And then when it comes to the private sector and the public sector, it's about encouraging them to work together.
Okay.
Instead of always being at odds.
Yeah.
So government can help businesses by cutting red tape.
Making it easier to operate.
But it also needs to hold them accountable.
Right.
Make sure they